I want to thank the organizers. What a privilege to close this fascinating session. I swear I didn't corrupt anybody.
Not yet.
Well, let me start with 3 examples. In 1891 in Kansas, the People's Party's press extensively covered the trial of a judge of the 13th District, the Republican Theodosius Botkin, for incompetence, immorality, and corruption. Among other things, he was accused of circumventing prohibition and engaging in alcohol-related corruption. In 1890, indeed, the state had adopted an amendment to establish prohibition, a decision supported by the Republican Party, which made it an important programmatic point in its fight against the Democrats and later against the Populists. The latter, largely originating from the GOP, were themselves mostly in favor of prohibition and attacked the moral hypocrisy of the Republicans on this issue. The Botkin affair then served to fuel their attacks and denunciations against the Republican Party. At the end of the year 1887 in France, the press revealed the involvement of Daniel Wilson, a deputy and the son-in-law of President Grévy, in a sham involving the trafficking of official decorations. A few months later, the emerging Populist movement seized upon the Wilson affair to fuel its press campaign against profiteering and the corruption of elected officials, targeting opportunist Republicans in power in particular, and more broadly, the entire parliamentary system. In Spain, in 1904, El Pueblo, the official newspaper of Basquism, targeted Enrique Capriles, the governor of Valencia and thus the official representative of the monarchy, and for several months, the newspaper accused him of failing to enforce the law against illegal gambling establishments in the city streets, thereby casting doubt on the morality of Capriles in carrying out his duties, whereas he was zealous in repressing the Republican Blasquist movement. These 3 examples of the politicization of scandals or of the political use of scandalous cases linked with political sphere demonstrate the dual utility of political movements in seizing upon such issues. On the one hand, they could deliberately fight against corruption to moralize politics, and on the other, they could instrumentalize these scandals in their struggles against their opponents within the political field. While politicization is thus understood here in 2 senses: first, to make the theme of corruption a political issue, and secondly, to manipulate corruption cases within political competition. And this is precisely what the 3 late 19th century movements mentioned, while Bolangism in France, Blasquism in Spain, in the area of Valencia, and the People's Party in Kansas did. They have been labeled populists by historiography, a vague and often dismissive concept, and however, in terms of political culture and programs, these movements align more closely with radical republicanism. They claim to restore the people's sovereignty, which had been seized by an economic and political oligarchy, through political reforms, particularly constitutional reforms, in order to democratize institutions. While they condemn the existing regimes for functioning in insufficiently democratic ways, their massive propaganda campaigns primarily targeted the ruling elites, what they held responsible for the prevailing crisis. In their analysis, the corruption of political elites, which were subjugated to all parts of the oligarchy, was both a symptom and a cause of this crisis. Of course, this was a rhetorical strategy, as denouncing the corruption of their opponents in power allowed them to discredit those rivals, to take their place by capturing protest votes. However, for opposition movements whose fate depended on the ballot box, it also means denouncing the corruption of suffrage, that is to say, electoral fraud and manipulations of the voting process. While purifying politics, therefore, means purifying elections corrupted by fraud and electoral deceits. This requires teaching the masses how to vote properly, ensuring they understood the procedures to protect the vote from manipulation, and improving institutions to fight these abuses. The politicization of political scandals thus contributed to the process of democratization and the political engagement of the masses. This is why I also aim to develop a socio-historical approach by exploring the repertoires of contention employed by these movements, that is to say, the media, and activist tools they implemented to denounce, to stage, and to fight corruption. And first, moralizing politics. Well, we have noted that these three movements emerged in the context of multiple crises: socio-economic crisis, national crisis, and political crisis, and they accused the political class and power of being responsible for the situation, either through their legislative actions or their inability to implement reforms. They thus sought to capture protest votes by denouncing an oligarchy that included elected officials serving its interests. The denunciation took the form of an anti-corruption rhetoric, which in France had a strongly anti-parliamentary tone. Boulangist newspaper daily denounced elected officials as crooks, thieves, carrying out manipulations, and Wilsonism, referring to the aforementioned Wilson affair, and the archival sources show the same sentiment among Boulangist supporters, who attacked pirates, I quote, manipulators, parliamentary plunder, and the oligarchy, a term that carries a corruptive dimension. In Valencia, the leftists were just as harsh as the Boulangists, condemning the plutocracy in power, a political mafia, immoral elected officials, and a corrupt administration that had been in place since the beginning of the Bourbon Restoration. And in Kansas, finally, the Farmers' Alliance and the People's Party believe that corruption dominates the ballots, the legislatures, and Congress, and has even reached the fur of the judiciary, and that power was in the hands of a band of thieves. The oligarchy was in power thanks to professional and corrupt politicians. It's all quotations. Indeed, corruption scandals were not uncommon during the Gilded Age in the United States, nor were the ties between the trusts and the two main parties, which provided ammunition for the party which believed that politicians were driven by greed and venality. In Kansas, for example, railroad companies were often denounced for offering free passes to elected officials in order to corrupt them. Furthermore, the Republican senator from Kansas, John Ingalls, he belongs to the same family as Charles Ingalls, a little house in the prairie, already accused of being the man of Wall Street and of the alcohol sellers, became the party's main target when he responded to the populist that, quotation, "The purification of politics is a new Edison doing." All these examples are taken from the press, which was at the heart of the media apparatus of these three movements. Several formal aspects must be noticed. Most of the articles were purely polemical, but sometimes they approached investigative journalism in a Quaker style. The use of large headlines, for example, still quite unusual at the time, were also notable. Cartoons in the specialized press in France and in weekly publications in the United States regularly depicted the corruption of elected officials. However, newspapers were not the only means of spreading the anti-corruption rhetoric. The Boulangists made extensive use of posters. In 1888, the editorial team of the newspaper La Cocarde covered the area around the chamber with posters reading "Down with the thieves," and during the election on January 1889, a tricolor poster displayed the slogan "Down with the parliamentary cliques, no more bribes, long live the honest republic." Well, political songs and poems also served as vehicles for this rhetoric, a medium that was both oral and written, since it was distributed in the form of leaflets, books, or articles in newspapers. The campaign against the governor of Valencia, Capriles, provided an opportunity for El Pueblo to publish numerous songs mocking his immorality. In Kansas, the People's Party published many book songs several of which featured lyrics hostile to corrupt politicians, such as the Sugar-Coated Pill and Unit Song. You've got these songs here in the board. And the Boulangistes preferred distributing songs in the form of leaflets sung in the streets by street vendors. Again, the corruption of elected officials was a recurring theme, and finally demonstrations were another way to occupy the auditory space in shooting slogans hostile to the corruption of elected officials and to occupy physically the public sphere. Finally, the elected officials of these movements, still in the minority and relatively powerless in the assemblies, could use their mandate as a platform to denounce the corruption of their opponents. On March 1889, the Boulangistes deputy Georges Laguerre denounced in the chamber the collusion between the Minister of the Interior and an insurance company. We can find similar speeches were made by the populist representative of Kansas, or by Blasco Ibáñez or Rodrigo Soriano in the Cortes. And we can thus see how the media strategies of this movement served the politicization of scandal and corruption in order to attack their opponents in power by portraying them as an oligarchy. However, their desire to normalize politics should also be understood as the purification of electoral process, whose integrity was questioned because of a political system considered undemocratic. Well, the corruption of the elites was only matched by their ability to lie to the voters. All three movements denounced demagogues, a term that was commonly used, who made elections insincere by lying to voters or by failing to keep their promise. Voters were highly sensitive to this discourse, as evidenced by the letters written by Boulangistes or populist supporters. The fault of the demagogues was that they were primarily interested in their personal gain and their mandate. This highlighted the consequence of the professionalization of politics, which deepened the divide between the representatives and the representative. But the corruption of the elections also had more concrete aspects. While male suffrage and liberal laws organized the three countries as democracies, electoral pressures and frauds remained significant. In Valencia, Blasquism was part of the regenerationist, it's very difficult to say, regenerationist movements and fought against caciquism, even though the city itself was somewhat spared. However, it confronted this issue in the peripheral neighborhoods such as Cabañal and in the villages of the Huerta, where clientelism, pressure and sometimes violence were exerted on the population. In Valencia itself, the Blasquists denounced at each election the vote-buying agencies or the distribution of false ballots by their opponents. In Kansas, the Republican Party bosses didn't hesitate to use illegal methods to ensure their electoral victory. On several occasions, the People's Party denounced the corruption set up by these bosses and their fixers, who were tasked with bribing elected officials. The 1892 elections provided an opportunity for widespread fraud in the Kansas House of Representatives. The People's Party denounced the election of ineligible candidates, fraudulent actions or cancellations of ballots. As a result, the GOP and the People's Party, holding executive power and a majority in the Senate, competed for control of the House of Representatives. And after a period of cohabitation, the situation now escalated into a civil war during the so-called Legislative War of Kansas. Boulangistes, on the other hand, had to face official pressures from prefects, mayors, and even civil servants, particularly during the 89 legislative elections, where fraud and various forms of pressure were widespread. In this context of unfinished democratization of political practices, opposition movements once again relied on their periodicals to denounce the abuses of corruption of electoral process. Institutional solutions, such as turning to the courts or authorities, were often unfavorable to opposition movements. In Kansas, for example, the Supreme Court sided with the Republicans despite of clear evidence of fraud. And in Valencia, as well as in France, governors or prefects either participated in or covered up the frauds. So, what solution to purify the ballot box? These movements could therefore only rely on themselves and on the vigilance of their activists and voters. The articles denouncing fraud and other scandalous practices could be seen as a practical solution to solve the problem. They informed voters of the various forms of fraud and promoted a better understanding of electoral procedures, which helped to reduce the impact of fraud. During election time, newspapers of the different movements thus transformed into real guides for voters. The three movements went even further by forming militant brigades tasked with monitoring and overseeing elections to prevent fraud. The Blaskists organized groups of scrutineers, interventores, responsible for overseeing the voting process at each polling station. Training sessions were held at the party headquarters, and instructions were published daily in El Pueblo. In Paris, the League of Patriots formed a group of inspectors for the by-election in January 1989. Several preparatory meetings were held at the beginning of the month, and detailed instructions were distributed to activists outlining their tasks. In Kansas, populist clubs were responsible for selecting supervisors with missions similar to those of the agents of the other two movements. You've got these organized documents for Blaskists and Boulangers from newspaper, and here it's the official documents which was given to all of the inspectors of the League of Patriots. Well, finally, they propose also institutional reforms to democratize the institution. They saw the problem as a more systemic problem. So, institutional reforms that they believed would help fight the corruption of elected officials and of elections. These reforms were guided by their radical republican culture, itself inspired by something like a Rousseauist spirit, which led to strong anti-parliamentarism and distrust of elected officials. To establish the honest republic, the Boulangists wished to expand control over elected officials through imperative mandates, the recall referendum, and the extension of popular sovereignty through the introduction of referendum and initiative. The People's Party also promoted the initiative and referendum based on the Swiss model to fight against corruption and the power of the bosses. The party also promoted Australian ballots, so secrecy of the ballot. While not advocating for the imperative mandate, both populists and Blaskists aligned with its logic in their approach of the link between candidates and voters. So the fight against political corruption will thus involve a reduction in the prerogatives and freedoms of elected officials. As a conclusion, while the Boulangist honest republic, the Blaskist triumph of morality, and the moral obsession of the People's Party showed that the moralization of politics was at the heart of the rhetoric of these movements. Their opponents, the elected officials in power, were denounced for their corruption and for the political practice they implemented to corrupt the vote, thus violating popular sovereignty. This demand was not merely populist demagoguery, as it led to reforms aimed at democratizing institutions and served as a lever to integrate the masses into politics. However, these movements were not without political compromise. They formed secret alliances with political forces opposed to their ideas in order to win elections. The Carlists in Ponència, the Democrats in Kansas, and the Monarchists in France. But rather than yielding the all-corrupt narrative, to spoil in French, it would be more fruitful to approach this as a socio-historian and ask whether the political field, which is based on getting and keeping power, does not inherently produce such practices. So in other words, is corruption a part of politics as usual? Thank you.